Das ist sie.
Nein, es ist Idayat da. Nein.
Alles gut, bis um halb. No, merci.
Good evening and a warm welcome. Dear Ambassador Simon Geisbühler, dear Excellencies, authors, panelists, and dear Idayat Hassan and Richard Youngs, who is joining us online. Good evening here in our medieval tower and the cyberspace of our live stream. It is a great honor to welcome all of you here at our Democracy Tower. My name is Stephanie Schüppach and I'm the Deputy Director of the Polit-Forum Bern and the curator of this tower. And currently I'm running the space as a director ad interim. We are here in the so-called prison tower, the Käfigturm. It was built in 1643 and served as a prison for about 500 years. Now we are an open access and free public debate forum. We are convinced that democracies need infrastructure. Safe and open spaces to listen, discuss and exchange are crucial elements of such an infrastructure. And we try to contribute to this with this Democracy Tower. Democracy is not a dry and theoretical matter. It's emotion. It's part of our everyday lives. And it's about shared experiences, shared decision-making, and also the idea that everyone living in a society is an expert for how we want to live peacefully together. And with different exhibition elements and also discussions on a variety of topics, we aim to provide a setting and a space to facilitate and empower everyone to engage for democracy and in their daily lives. But what do we understand under the term democracy? You all know there are many different definitions, many different forms. We base our work here on a wider, more problem-based approach of what democracy could be. This is proposed by Mark Warren. He's a professor emeritus of political science at the University of British Columbia. And he suggests not to only look at the different forms of democracy, but rather ask which problems a system needs to solve in order to be considered as democratic. And from this approach, we extracted 3 questions on which we base our work. The first is, who is included in a democracy and who is not? The second one, how are issues brought to public attention, but also how and by whom are they discussed? And the third one is, how do we decide together? The Democracy Tower is therefore, like just as democracy, constantly developing and evolving. In order to achieve this, it is important to include as many different voices and people as possible, from civil society, politics, science, and also culture. And so we try to include new and different perspectives, also with collaborations and exchanges with different parties, and just like tonight, with organizing events together. So we were very happy and honored when the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland contacted us with the question to organize tonight's book launch. And the topic and the concept of the book are a perfect match for the Democracy Tower. The contributions represented in the volume represent a variety of actors and observers in democracy, in different fields of democracy and also in democracy promotion. And also the topics proposed in the book are very diverse and very wide, which you will hear about more just now. So but before we start the discussion, just let me make some organizational remarks. You might have seen it, we have a photographer, Susanne Goldschmidt, she's over here in the room, and she will be taking pictures of the whole event. And we will also be filming the event for our live stream, and the video will also stay online afterwards. So if anyone doesn't want their picture to be taken or be filmed, just please let us know. I don't see any hands, so thank you. And the second remark is, as I just said, democracy lives by the contribution of as many voices as possible and the expertise of everyone. And so it is also very important to us that we not only discuss on the panel, but also to include you, the audience, in the discussions. And we will open the discussions for you after about 1 hour of discussion on the panel, and then you can ask your questions or comments. And for those watching us in the live stream, you can do this in the YouTube chat, or also on Slido. There's no registration needed. And I will follow the live stream and then bring in your questions into the space here at the tower. But now I would like to warmly welcome our three of the authors and the panelists, three panelists. Ambassador Simon Geisbühler, who's also the publisher of the book, if you want to say so. Idayat Hassan, joining us from Kenya. And we have Richard Youngs, joining us online. Welcome. And the discussions will be moderated by Marguerite Meyer. She's the former head of multimedia at swissinfo.ch, the foreign language service of Swiss Public Broadcasting Corporation. Since several years, Marguerite Meyer has been working as a freelance journalist with different mandates. So, for example, for building up the international desks of the online magazine republic.ch. And so she has a wide knowledge of tonight's topic as well, and we're very happy that she will be leading us through the discussion today. And I pass the word to you, Margaret, and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Warm welcome to everyone here. I'm very happy to have three amazing panelists here from Switzerland, Nigeria, and the UK tonight. It's the Buchvernissage, so first we will have a keynote speech. Then we will have a panel, which will have plenty of time to delve into many of the questions that are arising from the different, very interesting, very diverse chapters of the book. And we will, as Stephanie mentioned, have plenty of time to answer questions from the audience. So at this point, I would really encourage you to also, as the panel goes on, as the keynotes go on, to think about questions that are pressing for you, also with regard to Switzerland, but also with regard to Switzerland in the world, the role of Switzerland in the world, and the world in general. So first, I would like to basically just hand over for the keynote speech. Next to me is Ambassador Simon Geisbühler. He is the head of the Peace and Human Rights Division at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. A warm welcome to Simon.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this book launch and panel discussion on democracy and democracy promotion in a fractured world. This event, co-organized with the Polit-Forum Bern, is a milestone in a journey we started about 3 years ago at the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, which I have the honor to head. Today, we commemorate the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, an important reminder of the relevance of serious, fact-based journalism as a cornerstone of a functioning democracy. It is also no coincidence that we are here in the so-called Democracy Tower. Not that democracy needs to sit in a tower. To me, democracy is fluid. But a Democracy Tower is the place in Bern where democracy can be experienced, seen, even touched. Thank you so much for having us, Stephanie, and to the whole team here. I was always struck by the fact that while the constitutional mandates, according to Article 54 of the Swiss Constitution, to promote the respect for human rights and the peaceful coexistence of peoples were implemented thoroughly, the mandate to promote democracy, however, used to be more of an afterthought in Swiss foreign policy. This contrasts with the largely positive Swiss experience with our own democracy, and it contrasts also with Swiss public opinion. In an opinion poll conducted in 2021, a whopping 93% of the respondents considered the mandate in Article 54 of the Swiss Constitution to promote democracy abroad important or even very important. A massive 80% in the same poll stated that the democratic tradition of Switzerland preordained Swiss foreign policy to promote democracy worldwide. However, Switzerland has never really been at the forefront of global democracy promotion, for reasons I have no time to go into here, but happy to discuss later on if you would like to do so. In all fairness, a lot of very valuable work has been done. Let me briefly mention, for example, what the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC, calls democratization in support of integrated, sustainable development, and its efforts in the promotion of decentralization, local participation, local good governance. The capacity building support SDC provides for civil society or the support it has granted to the design of constitutional frameworks in fragmented multicultural societies and countries, taking into consideration and adapting the Swiss model of federalism and power sharing. In the Peace and Human Rights Division, we have provided concrete contributions to electoral integrity, have been sending Swiss experts to election observation missions, and promoted democracy via our human rights diplomacy, focusing, for example, on the freedom of expression, free media, and the protection of minorities. Things are not looking very good for democracy right now, at least not at first glance. For almost 20 years now, democracy has been in retreat worldwide. Its erosion has become globally pervasive. Some even speak about the beginning of an authoritarian century. Following the short unipolar moment after 1989, the world quickly entered into an era of heightened global polarization and rapid authoritarian resurgence. As a political scientist stated 2 years ago, I cite, "It feels like the order we have all taken for granted since the end of the Cold War is badly decaying and has gotten so fragile that it might well shatter soon. Worse than the decay itself, however, is what feels like our inability to perceive just how advanced it is." An excessively euphoric attitude towards democracy after 1989 rapidly tilted towards an equally distorted, negative and pessimistic one. It has become fashionable in democracies to talk bad about democracy. Democracies are faced with a worrisome trend of weakening support for their institutions and increasing dissatisfaction with democracy itself. We are clearly facing a deep trust crisis. These trends are fomented by digitalization in general and social media in particular. Bill Clinton was still sure in 2000 that, I quote, "Liberty will spread by mobile phone." Something else has happened since. Digitalization can shrink the democratic space through surveillance, and it can worsen polarization. It can undermine democracy, and it is often used precisely to that end. We will hear more about that from Idayat in a moment. Many democracies erode from within, but they are also under increased pressure from the outside. But not all is that bad. There are some bright spots. And as always, decline, in this case democratic decline, is not a foregone conclusion. we can do something against it, or to put it differently, we can do something for democracy. Each of us as individuals, but also collectively. We can and should tackle the challenge of democratic backsliding and decline in a systematic and coherent way. As Federal Councillor Ignazio Cassi stated in August 2022, the promotion of democracy is a task given to us by the Federal Constitution. In this regard, Switzerland can and will do more. We can support other states in strengthening their democracies if they ask us to do so. Vis-à-vis non-democratic states, we will self-confidently defend our core values. This is part of our interest-based foreign policy. We want to convey a positive message, not against anyone, but for democracy. Democracy remains a powerful idea to unite around. We often say that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. I humbly disagree. I think democracy is much more than that. I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight. I'm really thrilled to have Idayat and Richard here, Idayat in the room and Richard online. It is an honor and a pleasure you are able to join us tonight. Idayat and Richard were with us for our first Giesbach Democracy Retreat in spring 2022. We hosted senior officials from 7 countries to discuss the state of democracy and the way forward regarding democracy promotion. Idayat and Richard were with us as outstanding experts. You will find their contributions in our book, which is in fact an outcome of the Giesbach retreats in 2022 and 2023, and the book should serve as an inspiration to all of us. Before we get started here, let me thank all those who have made this evening possible. First, the fantastic team of the Polit-Forum, thank you so much again. Then the Lied publishing house, Lied Verlag, which did a tremendous job in getting out the book just in time. And then I also thank my small democracy team, Rahel and Christina, now reinforced by its new head of section, Ariadna. They had to put up with my ideas, which were sometimes a bit crazy, and without them we would not be here tonight. One last thing that is important for you to know, the opinions in the book and raised by our panelists tonight do obviously not necessarily reflect the views of the Swiss government, and it is exactly the pluralism and the competition of ideas that is the backbone of a lively and functioning democracy, and I look really forward to our discussion tonight. Back to you.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased to welcome the other 2 panelists tonight, before they will give us a bit of a presentation of their chapter that they have written for this book that will be available tonight as well for everyone here. So first, I would like to welcome Idayat Hassan. She is a lawyer and the senior associate at the African Center for Strategic and International Studies in Abuja, Nigeria. No?
Thank you very much.
Yeah?
Non-resident, Center for Strategic and International Studies,
Okay.
DC.
And then this is in the room, and then on Zoom we have Richard Youngs. He's a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program at Carnegie Europe and a professor for international relations at the University of Warwick. Welcome as well. Can you hear us, Richard?
I can hear you. Good evening. Hi.
Good evening. Hi. So maybe we will start with you, Richard, with your presentation of the chapter. Take your time. We have plenty of time tonight. The stage is yours.
Good evening to everyone, and I sincerely apologise for not being there in person. I was looking forward to catching up with Idayat and others who were at our first retreat, but hopefully I can still contribute usefully to your debate. My role in Simon's book was to think about the way that international democracy support has evolved over time. My basic line is this, and it's a...
Richard.
Support clearly has faced deepening challenges over the last several years. It has begun to lose traction, It's having to work in a much more challenging environment, but it's not dead. The era of democracy promotion is not completely over. The whole enterprise of international democracy support is still needed. There is still demand for it. Democracy support can still be useful if it learns to update itself with a very turbulent and changing times in which we live. So that's my basic proposition. If we go back to the starting point that Simon referred to, the Cold War period in the early 1990s, this is when many Western governments really began in earnest to prioritize the support of democracy around the world. The significant thing was that at this stage, the so-called third wave of democratization was gathering momentum. So international efforts to support democratic reforms around the world were to some extent moving with the grain of this third wave of democratization and helping in quite powerful ways to propel it forward. The key actor here was the United States. The United States began systematically to place democracy issues in its foreign policy quite early on. Then we had actors like the European Union. Some individual member states of the European Union began to follow suit, as well as other actors like Switzerland, Norway, Canada, Australia, and a little bit later on, Japan and Korea. So this became an increasingly internationalized agenda. Even there was some increasing amount of attention and funding channeled through the United Nations to give international democracy support also some modest degree of multilateral effort as well. And we saw the creation of organizations like the Community of Democracies that reflected what appeared to be quite a significant international momentum growing behind the expansion of democratic norms across the world. The forefront, the main element of this agenda was about democracy assistance. Many governments were channeling quite significant amount of money during the 1990s and early 2000s into the kind of very useful projects that Simon was just giving us an outline of. There was lots of non-aid political support for democratic reform as well, technical support, expertise, the setting up of civil society networks. There was a growing use of so-called democratic conditionality, governments in the West conditioning their engagement, their funding, their trade relations on democratic norms with countries elsewhere in the world. You would all know that there was some debate about so-called liberal interventionism as well, the use of military intervention to support democratic reforms. This wasn't used in any systematic extent, but the fact that there was a debate around this kind of issue, kind of intervention at this stage reflected just how prominent an agenda this seemed to have become into the years of the early 2000s. So the primary element of international democracy support was this whole wealth, almost an industry of democracy assistance projects run in huge numbers of countries around the world, and with actors like the United States and the European Union channeling several hundreds of millions of dollars or euros into these kinds of projects each year. So this all seemed to be working. It seemed to be effective. It seemed to be making a difference in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. In hindsight, this looked as if it was the optimal moment for democracy support. Democracy support policies were working with the grain of demand for democratic reform around the world and crucially, helping many of the new democracies, countries that had already made essential democratic breakthroughs, turfed out authoritarian leaders, and were looking for international support to help consolidate their democratic transitions. So we saw, to this end, a mix of aid for democratic reformers and conditionality being exerted to press forward governments to keep them on track in their promised democratic reforms. So this seemed to be the optimal moment when democracy support really counted for something. One should not idealize this period of time, the 90s and the early 2000s. In this period, there were still many countries around the world, many regimes around the world, resisting democratic change. Democratic support was never the absolute number one priority of Western governments. But nonetheless, this was a so-called liberal era in which democracy support seemed to be having some kind of tangible impact. All that has changed, or a lot of that has changed in line with the kind of evolution that Simon was mapping out. This momentum has seeped away into the 2010s and the 2020s. We have the democratic regression that Simon outlined. In my chapter in the book, I go into some detail mapping out what this democratic regression actually entails. One should emphasize here, if anything, the expansion in democracy has plateaued in recent years, and there are still many countries in which democratic reform is moving forward in a positive way. So one shouldn't think that it's an era just of democratic recession or democratic regression. But overall, clearly the trends are not particularly promising, and international democracy support has had to adapt to these very much more challenging times. Conceptually, it's important to recognize that there are three different challenges in this more illiberal era. First of all, autocracies, authoritarian regimes, have become more robust, less defensive, more assertive in closing the space and the availability of international actors to work in favor of human rights within their borders. Second, new democracies seem to be more subject to reversals. Countries that look as if they've made democratic transitions, and previously one might have expected to move relatively smoothly and quickly towards full democratic consolidation, today are not making that transition. A very, very common tendency today is for countries to have democratic revolutions, to move forward a number of modest steps towards democratic politics, and then to suffer reversals back towards authoritarian politics. A huge challenge for the international democracy support enterprise. And third, distinctive challenge is that of hybrid regimes. These are the most common form of political regime around the world today, is that of the so-called hybrid regime, countries that show a mixture, combination of authoritarian and democratic politics. Today, many countries seem to get stuck in this halfway house between authoritarianism and democracy. Governments in these countries are quite good at digging themselves in and finding ways of closing off or forestalling any deeper democratic change. Again, a big challenge to the more classical form of democracy support that seem to be able to push these kinds of transitions forward incrementally in previous years, whereas today they do not seem to be succeeding to the same extent in getting these kind of hybrid regimes out of this mixed combination of authoritarian and political dynamics. So there are distinctive challenges there when we talk about the difficulties facing democracy promotion today. And I think the difficulties are so severe, they're so deeply rooted, because there are a number of different forces, a number of different factors driving this atrophy, this stagnation of international democracy support. Many people say that, in a way, many of the hard cases remain. Many of the countries most susceptible to democratic reform have already democratized. Western democracies are no longer the kind of ideal city on the hill, or they no longer provide a kind of magnetic reference point for democratic reformers in other countries. There is the China factor and other non-democratic countries growing power and resources in many countries around the world. And importantly, within countries that seem to be undergoing democratic reforms, we see growing polarization. And this growing polarization can pull apart pro-democratic alliances and coalitions and make the job of international democracy supporters in taking forward democratic reforms much, much more complicated. And then finally, of course, we have the changed security context with the growing number of conflicts around the world, presenting geopolitical challenge to Western countries in a way that seems to cut across and take some of the momentum out of international democracy support. So all these factors have added to these very severe challenges facing democracy support. We can see this at very operational level, where there are many people highly committed to the kind of projects that Simon was outlining, but who today just find it more and more difficult to operate, to implement their projects on the ground, because they are facing increased repression from regimes, and repression in much cleverer and more astute and more challenging ways on the ground. Funds from authoritarian regimes are coming in and often almost deliberately neutralizing the impact of pro-democratic initiatives. And even where the international community is able to get significant support to pro-democratic reformers, to big civil society organizations, many of these CSOs themselves seem to have lost credibility and legitimacy with their own populations. And this disconnect between local populations and NGOs, democracy activists, is a breach that the international actors have struggled to help overcome. So, in a sense, for all these reasons, for all these multiple reasons, international democracy support has begun to tread water and lose some of its impact in recent years. Given all this, one might expect the whole area of democracy support to be dead, but it isn't. Many think the era of international democracy support has definitively passed, but it does still live on in the whole multiplicity of programs of the like that Simon outlined. Many donors are still pumping significant amounts of funding into the democracy support enterprise. I would frame it like this. Democracy support still lives, it can still be revived, it still exists to a meaningful extent, but its very essence has changed. Today, democracy support is much more defensive. What we see is what I would term a more defensive democracy support. Today, international democracy support is not, as it was in the 1990s, about trying to inexorably expand the universe of democratic countries, democratic regimes, but it is more modest in ambition and aims rather just keeping open some degree of meaningful democratic space, democratic pluralism, and to protect democratic activists from increased repression from authoritarian and hybrid regimes across the world. So that's how I would describe the essential change we've seen in international democracy support in recent years. The emergence, democracy support has not completely ended. It still does exist to quite a significant degree, but it is much more defensive in nature than was the case 10 or 20 years ago. That may sound a very downbeat conclusion to reach, but there are still positives. There are positives in this changing scenario of international democracy support. Democracy is struggling, but the demand for democracy remains high across the world. We speak of a crisis of democracy, but authoritarian governments are also experiencing crisis. I think it is more accurate to talk about a crisis of governance across the world that affects both democracies and autocracies. It is not the case, for all the problems that democracies are facing, it is not the case that autocracies have shown themselves so much more superior and able to deliver on citizens' demands. There are emerging forms of democratic activism and innovation emerging across the world that give the promise of a new dynamism to democratic reform movements. And many of these different kinds of democratic movements do want international support to try and help move their objectives forward. So for all these reasons, I believe that democracy support does have a future, but clearly international democracy policy needs to adapt, it needs to reinvent itself, and it needs to move democracy support into a fundamentally different era than the era of kind of liberal democratic expansion that we saw up to the early 2000s. That would be my basic proposition to contribute to tonight's debate.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your insights. We will get back to what you've mentioned later on in the panel discussion. I would like to hand over to Idayat now for an introduction to her chapter.
Oh, thank you very much. And I think it's very good that Richard raised the fact that either authoritarian or democratic governments, they are all struggling for legitimacy and struggling to continue to exist in the country where they rule and before their citizens. So we have the same challenges coming up there. And I think my own chapter actually looks at one of the challenges against democracy itself, and that is the role social media is currently playing in undermining democracy, which of course I like to frame as the information disorder. And coming from Africa, always we continue to say that there are still positives, that social media represent positives for the region, because with social media we've been able to hold elected officials accountable. It's been easier to actually monitor elections, either crowdsourcing or even using WhatsApp platform when you deploy traditional observers. It's in terms of service deliveries, we've seen policies change just by push from social media. We have had hashtag this fee must fall in South Africa. We've had the NSAS itself, mobilization against police brutality in Nigeria. We've had few, and most of these have actually represented positives. We had the Not Too Young to Run as well, which led to the change of the years of contesting accessibility or eligibility to contest for elections in the Nigerian constitution. So there are positives, but alongside these positives, there are also lots of negatives, really, that we are encountering when it comes to the role information disorder is actually playing in the current democratic contest. And for us, the problem is that it's nothing new. It's as old as society itself. We say that it's been there even before Goebbels, and it will continue to be. But the problem now is that with social media, the reach, the multiplicity of actors that are involved, from individuals to companies, to foreign governments, to domestic actors, to businesses, really that are in the space, of course, makes it much more heightened than the multiplicity of techniques. So this is not just about word of mouth. With bots, you can recreate. Astroturfing, you can do so much. With everything technology or AI, artificial intelligence, for all its positives, it also has got negatives in terms of engendering disinformation itself. And this is a very big challenge because of the reach. In 1 minute, we are talking here, this can actually go around the whole world, more than what a newspaper article or even television could actually achieve. It can be seen in the United States, it can be seen in Kenya, and it can be viewed everywhere in a matter of minutes itself. And this is what has made this current phase extremely difficult. But in terms of actuals also, we see that it is having so much implication on democracy itself. For everything we push for, it takes it away. When Ambassador Simon was talking about inclusivity, has a very important component of democracy. As the ethos that democracy really lies on, we find that this information disorder is taking away what we are doing or even investing so much in promoting in terms of democratic support. Think of gendered disinformation and how it's actually being used to attack women in itself, either in the United States elections or in Kenya or Little Cape Verde in West Africa. Women have actually been impacted in elections here. The leak of the Hillary Clinton's emails and how it's actually impacted the win, or how even if a female presidential candidate's video manipulated and pictures were circulated on the eve of the elections. It did not just impact our win. At the end of the day, nobody was actually brought to account. Even women in the civic space, the way they are made to feel that they do not have the necessary capacity that a man will have. So as much as we invest so much in promoting inclusion, either of women, young or old, persons with disability, we also have the same platform taking it away from us. Then we talk about democracy itself, the ethos of democracy, the narratives that are also being set, which enables authoritarians to actually set narratives that democracy lacks. Democracy is not necessarily the way out. For instance, it's abound where you hear in developing context how democracy is not able to deliver dividends to the people. That the participatory structure of democracy itself makes the delivery of democracy, dividends of that development extremely difficult, because you have to go to parliament before you get orders. You have to go, in case you have disagreement, you go to the judiciary. The precept that we call democracy, the doctrine of separation of powers, the checks and balances that we look up to, these are the things that are actually in contest here. Then also the idea that you can lie your way out of everything is fast becoming an ideology and a way of life itself. So instead of the core ideological precept of rule of law, of truth, of rights and duties, it's more in terms of lies that we are encountering. And this is really, really a difficult thing, especially when you go to developing context, where people are more interested in what democracy brings onto the table for them. Is it public goods in terms of light or power, water, healthcare? It's not able to bring it, but they can point easily to China and say that they are able to raise the GDP in a matter of years, even more than what the United States was able to achieve in a decade. And these are lived realities, really, for them. And I think these are quite important things that we really have to look at in the long run, because the people who should hold forth to democracy themselves are being burdened and are losing trust in this democracy because of this ideology of lying itself. And it's also important to say that it impinges on participation. So when you have information overload itself, the ability to go out and participate constructively becomes a problem. This is not just about elections, really. Most times, yes, we have a lot of electoral disinformation where choosing the right candidate becomes extremely difficult because of weaponization of information. But participation is also at stake at this point, because you start feeling heuristic, you start feeling low, okay, why should I even participate? What is the essence of participation? At every point in time, you get a deluge of information to process. And this actually pulls you back in terms of what to do. And I think it's really a national security issue also. Maybe it will even become more of an international security issue beyond the national security issue. In developing context, particularly in crisis situation, we will say that even terrorist groups are weaponizing disinformation in terms of making people to believe that they are stronger than the state. It's part of their strategy in terms of governance strategy, like in a proto-state, really. It's also a response strategy to the work of the security agencies and dampening trust. But it's actually more when you look at the way it factionalizes parts of the country itself, and when it's being weaponized as an ideology itself, which we can start talking about even cultural and ethnicization of some of these issues, and we have seen where it started, and it had led to the breakdown of law and order. I think we had that in Côte d'Ivoire during the last elections in 2020, and several people were killed all over fake news. We've had experienced the same several times in Nigeria, where doctored pictures from one part, maybe from Congo, will be shared in volatile central Nigeria, and many people will go on and start killing each other and to believe this. So there are lots of challenges when it comes to disinformation in different phases, beyond natural disaster, beyond the issue of health, but really as it relates to the core of democracy itself. But the response itself is become problematic, because the response that is being crafted also becomes challenging to democracy in itself. One of the immediate responses is often maybe internet shutdown itself. And when you have internet shutdown, of course, you do not just shut down voices of people and their ability to communicate, you also shut down businesses. But there are also different forms of shutdown in some other work I've been doing with colleagues. You can even easily shut down voices, considering that today we are marking is an auspicious occasion when it comes to press freedom. Using bots, you are able to immediately pollute the media itself and critical voices, because they lose the opportunity to talk, and even journalism itself becomes really at stake in this instance. But important is also the issue of regulation. When there are challenges, we often think in terms of let's regulate ourselves out of it. Do we create laws? Most of these laws that are also being created impinge on freedom of expression, freedom of media, and is being weaponized to attack journalists. So if I take West Africa as an example, in a space of 3 years, out of the 15 ECOWAS countries, like 12 of the countries either reviewed their laws, I think 5 had new laws, the 7 others decided to review their framework in terms of dealing with disinformation as a part of it. And there are plethora of frameworks, and this makes it very difficult for independent voices to actually engage. And most of the times, these laws are also being used as excuses to arrest critical voices in society. So I think in conclusion is to start saying that information manipulation itself is a national security challenge, and it's something that requires more resources devoted to it, more resources, both financial and human resources, and it should actually take a high place up there in society. And especially when we start talking about we are now in a very connected space where we are which is borderless. What is treated in Switzerland today can easily find itself in different parts of the world. And the actors can operate out of Switzerland to actually interfere in any of those backwater countries, as you may want to think of it, that we might not even think are quite important, and it will have huge impacts in those countries, really. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Idayat, for this very interesting insight. I would like to start with a question to Ambassador Simon Geisbühler, because I think before we dive into the topic, there's some clarification of terminology to do, so we're all on the same page. I'll start with a very, very basic question. You mentioned before, Idayat, that democracy is not just about elections. What is democracy about?
Great question. We struggled with this very basic questions when we collected all these contributions to the book. The publisher told me several times, you have to have a definition at the beginning of the book. What is democracy? We cannot just have all these articles and they talk about different things. I think it is not it is not that important that we find a definition that is acceptable to everybody, because I think it's not possible. As you rightly said, elections are key, and they're key in each and every democracy, but obviously they're not enough. There is much more than election. It's institutions, but I think it's also mindsets. It's both. When I talk about institutions, I mean also fundamental freedom, fundamental rights, human rights. This is part of a democratic environment, and these are institutions. Then, of course, you have parliament, you have the whole electoral infrastructure that has to be put in place. So the institutional part is very important, but also the protection of rights, protection also of minority rights. This is key in each and every democracy. And then I think it depends also a bit on to a certain degree on a mindset. Democracy is not something natural, I would say. Even so, I think, and Richard has alluded to that, there is a huge demand across the globe for democracy. So there is something there, but you also have to learn democracy. You have to relearn it. You have to live it, and you have to have, as Idayat alluded to it, also you have to have access to good information. You have to have access to education also. So it's a broad set of elements that lead to what we call democracy. And we have to also accept that there are different traditions, historical sources. I might get back to the Botswana example because it's my most beloved example when it comes to democracy and the exchanges we had in the last 2 years. Also, Idayat was also there in Giersbach when we had a colleague from Botswana there. And it's clear that democracy can come from different sources, and we end up in a similar place, but not exactly the same place. So I'm sorry that I dodged the question, but I think there is nobody who can really give you a clear-cut answer, because you will always find another element, and you will weigh these elements differently.
You dodged the question, but you did it very elegantly.
Thank you.
Maybe we can try to find just a clarification of not maybe democracy as a term, but we've heard now democracy promotion, assistance, support, protection. How do these terms differ from each other? Richard, maybe.
So for many years, most European donors, EU institutions, tend to prefer talking about democracy support, that they perceive to be a little bit less intrusive than the terminology of democracy promotion that came from the United States. One can argue that that's fairly semantic as a difference, but it does reflect something of the European caution in their democracy support policies to be seen to be lending a hand to reformers who already have some momentum and some credibility with their populations, rather than to be parachuting in particular models or understandings of democracy where that internal momentum and reform demand does not exist. To that extent, when European governments engage in democracy support, they generally do so around a broadly liberal understanding of democracy, competitive politics allied with constitutionalized protection of individual rights. But very interesting, if you look at the speeches of European leaders over the last several years, they have increasingly insisted that European democracy support is not limited to a particular model of democracy. The European governments are completely open to alternative forms of democracy. Critics would say that's pure rhetoric, and in reality, European governments still need to show themselves to be more open and flexible to alternative models of democracy. Academically, one would have to say what kinds of alternative models of democracy really exist is quite a complicated question. And again, a challenge that democracy support organizations still need to face. So I would say in that sense that in terms of, Marguerite, your question about terminology, democracy support seems to, at least in Europe, become the main term. But as the democracy support agenda has narrowed down a little bit as democracy has faced these more severe threats. Many people talk about democracy protection. And that, I think, reflects some of what I wanted to say, suggest in my concept of more defensive democracy support, but it's more aimed at trying to prevent more serious reversals of democratic norms and repression against democratic activists. So I think we are seeing a shift in your terminology, perhaps from democracy support to democracy protection. Not completely, but it does at least reflect some of the change in ethos behind international organizations' strategies.
Thank you, Richard. You mentioned that is definitely more of a European perspective when it comes to support, maybe a less promotion sounds very like self-interested as an approach. What is the terminology like in an African context, Idayat?
Yeah, I think these days people are talking about democracy being rooted in local contexts, really. And most of these are coming from the actors themselves. They are not necessarily from the people. So it's a new kind of narrative that is being built. Like, yes, we have to define what our democracy is. It doesn't necessarily have to be two-term limit when you are vying for office. It's rooted in local culture. What is acceptable, particularly when you talk about some rights like LGBT, is not necessarily acceptable in the African context. But the fact remains that democracy must be rooted in some ideals that are universal, and that is right, really. When you ask most of us that are practitioners and working on issues of democracy, what is most important for me as an individual are those fundamental rights that democracy is actually accorded me. If you take away those rights and you give developments, you look at it at the end of the day that you are actually losing more. And even when we are talking in terms of the resurgence of authoritarianism, people are still pushing back because of the lack of rights in those regimes. So rights are really important. They are much more important at every point in time. And election is just the beginning of democracy. It's just like the vote itself. And it needs to germinate and deliver to the people. So it's just one tiny aspect of democracy. That's more how people are seeing it. Yes, it's a celebration of democracy, a celebration, a festival. Yes, we call it like the festival of democracy. That's what it really is. There are those things like checks and balances, the doctrine of separation of powers. Those are the things people want to see. And also this democracy giving us public goods and development. So the idea of democracy promotion is very, very important because we feel democracy is endangered at this point in time. But that must also be done alongside these basic precepts, really.
You mentioned a celebration of democracy. It's something I've read and heard before. In this context, Simon Geisbühler, you mentioned in your introduction, I think it was, that, and quote, you were quoting someone, that it should be not just the best of all the bad solutions or forms, but it should be a party, literally a party. And I would like to ask you what this party should look like and who is the DJ?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, when we talk about democracy, we also, of course, tonight it's a very serious thing and we take it very seriously. But in fact, if you think about it, and Idayat alluded to it, it's something fantastic that you can vote. I mean, the vote itself is something great. When I received, when was it? 1 month ago, all the lists of candidates for the national elections. I mean, it was fun to go through these lists. I found this interesting to look at these people, try to find out. We have this tool, the smart vote, when you can put in your points of view, and then it gives you the candidates that are closest to you. I found it was really great, and I have seen this also in a lot of countries where I have served, in Romania and in Poland, we had always great contacts with young people in universities, and they were always extremely interested in the Swiss direct democracy experience. Not that they thought that they would copy it, but just to learn about other models. And I think sometimes we lack a bit this enthusiasm, this happiness to have this tremendous possibility to live in a democratic society and to vote. And sometimes we see it as a burden. Okay, I agree, if you get like 500 pages with candidates, there can also be the other reaction and say, whoa, that's too much. But in a way, it's something great. And I like the quote of this French author, a French political scientist, who said, in fact, how can we make sure that also in our Western European democratic societies that this is again some fun. It's something that we can happy about, and he said democracy should be a party.
Okay. Is it maybe part of the nature of a well-functioning democracy that people take it as a given and just don't, many things that are we look at as a given, we don't feel like we need to fight for it. In the Nigerian context, as far as I understand, it's quite a young democracy compared to Switzerland, for example, although Switzerland also has a history of being quite exclusionary. I don't have to tell you about the women's right to vote in 71. It's always a hoot at international gatherings. But so I understand that Nigeria is one of the largest democracies on the continent. It's quite vibrant. It has a comparatively young population. What is the demand for participation like?
The demand for participation is very, very huge currently. And you find that with quite a young population. In fact, our last voters register, we just finished our elections, general elections, March 2023. And more than 50% of the people on the voters register were young people, really. In fact, if you take it cumulatively, you have more than 60% between the age of 18 to 35. So it's actually a youth vote because the age youth is between 18 to 35 in that contest, and they are able to make the difference. And with social media, it also enlivened people to their responsibilities of participation. I think that's the most active season in the country. And following the last elections, it has not ended because people have continued to push, not just for accountability, but even the acceptability of the outcome itself. But when we say that democracy is a party, it's the excitement that it also gives, the ability to choose somebody. The fact that most times we would have endured 4 or 5 years, and after these 4 or 5 years, you have the opportunity to use your vote to actually vote out the people. And this lost at every point in time for credible elections, where you feel that the voice counts. So this is about voices also. It's about voices. But what is often missing in the developing context is that it's not it's a party at the point of voting. But it's not a party because I'm a Lagosian, so I'm from Nigeria. And in that part of the world, they love parties a lot. And when you go to parties, you do not just go there wearing your beautiful clothes. You want to eat the rice and chicken, jollof rice, chicken, and maybe a bottle of soft drinks, preferably Coke. But at the end of the day, haven't gone to the polling unit, and you've queued for 4 or 5 hours. You have looked forward to this activity for the last 6 months. You have participated. When it comes to the point of that party, the real party in the real sense of getting your plate of jollof rice and chicken with a bottle of Coke, then the party disappears. And that is what is missing when we talk about this being a celebration. So it's a celebration, but it's a celebration that we never see it come to fruition eventually. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to move to Richard. You mentioned before, you mentioned, Simon, that democracy is fluid. And I think it's important that we talk about democracy versus autocracy at this moment. And Richard, you mentioned you would like to talk a bit about this. How do we, where does democracy stop and where does autocracy start, to put it that way?
Political regimes can be placed on a spectrum from perfect democracy through to complete totalitarianism. There isn't one neat dividing line between democracy and autocracy. So all regimes are shades along this political spectrum. I think it's better to talk in terms of degrees of democracy, democraticness or quality of democracy, rather than democracy being an absolute. That may seem like a rather arcane academic point, but I think it has an important operational implication that actually relates to what Simon and Idayat were just saying. And that is that over the last several years, we have seen quite a fluidity in the way in which citizens are trying to mobilize to defend democracy. In a way, democracies have become perhaps a little bit overly defensive. It is certainly the case there has been this very powerful, what analysts refer to as an authoritarian surge. Authoritarian regimes feel that they are doing well, feel more assertive and powerful on the international scene. That is an undoubted fact. But it is also a concern, I think, that democracies perhaps become a little bit too defensive or too downbeat in democracy's advantages. It is absolutely healthy that democracies have lost some of the hubris of the 1990s and early 2000s. Marguerite, you mentioned a very important point, which is it is actually positive for citizens to recognize that democracy is not an automatic default. That it is not a given, that it can evaporate very quickly and very easily. I think that is a lesson that has been learned in recent years and has prompted citizens to mobilize across democracies and partially open regimes in favor of deepening democracy. So I think in that sense we're seeing quite an interesting battle, quite a vital battle emerge between democracy and autocracy, precisely in this kind of grey area where countries are not either purely democratic or purely authoritarian. I think that kind of terrain is where the direction of future democracy is going to be mapped out. You suggested this point about democracy being a party in a kind of light-hearted way, but it does actually reflect quite a serious point that has become evident in recent years, which is this, that citizens may have become disaffected with democratic politics, with representative democracy, but that hasn't translated into apathy. Citizens are mobilized, but they're just mobilized in different ways and searching for different kinds of democratic engagement. And I think that kind of fluidity captures the kinds of dynamics that are going to be really determinant in this battle between democracy and autocracy, and in relation to which democracy support organizations still haven't quite caught up with the magnitude of these kind of political changes inside countries around the world.
Maybe we can go a bit more into the question why this shift happened over the last decade.
Sorry, this was to me?
Yes, sorry. I'm looking at the screen here, but I should be looking at the camera here. Yes, this shift that you were describing of the last decade with regard to, yeah.
I think Idayat was getting to the heart of this. It's this feeling that democracies are not delivering, and this has fed frustration. It's fed more kind of illiberal politics in many existing democracies. The fact that democracies have perhaps become a little bit inward-looking, to step back from their international commitments. And I think a feeling that the formal institutional channels of representative democracy are perhaps not delivering. I don't think one should take that argument too far. As I said in my opening remarks, authoritarian states are struggling on many of the big existential challenges just as much as democracies are. For example, climate change. There's no evidence yet that authoritarian states are doing much better than democracies in addressing the climate agenda. But I think still there is this growing frustration that democracies are not dealing with some of the big issues. And I think there's a kind of healthy realization on the part of citizens that they need to mobilize into different forms of engagement. But one shouldn't overestimate the potential of these new forms of democratic engagement. But I think they're there and they are significant, and they at least give some hope that the international democracy agenda can revive itself and prove to be resilient and dynamic going forward.
Thank you. You mentioned, Idayat, that oftentimes they are not, democracies are not perceived as delivering or putting concrete things on the table. And my question that arises is that often democracy or democratic values are associated with what we call Western values or liberal values. And might it be that a large part of the world just does not feel like these values are actually for them or are made for them?
No. I think some values are just universal. There are no ways to put it other than that. And when we talk in terms of delivering, either it's autocracy or it's a democracy, the key public goods are quite important here. So what do people want, really? What are the demands for democracy? The demand for democracy most times is just having good jobs, which is the work of any leader, really. It's really about having good roads. It's about having potable water. It's about having power in your home. It's really about having food on your table. And these are basic things that every government must put on the table, really. And why it's not also happening is basically a lot of issues which democracy promotion or democracy support is not looked at. Most times it's been concentrated on looking on at elections. Corruption or kleptocracy is one important aspect, really. Are we stopping the flow of resources from out of the country into, sometimes we even say the global north or the north, really? How are we blocking those leakages that makes it not to work, really? Then what is the response of democracy support organizations to unconstitutional changes in government, really? So if I take where I work, West Africa, as an example, in the last 3 years, we have experienced more unconstitutional change of government than elsewhere. People tend to talk about it more from the prism of coup d'etats, but coup d'etats is just one aspect of unconstitutional change of government. Now I'm looking at it like from 4 prisms: coup d'etat, flawed elections as important one. How many elections have been held that are not flawed? What about it? We say a constitutional coup d'etat as well, where people will then come and change the constitution to give themselves either more terms in office or to put suitable measures that favors them in it, and even the people's revolt themselves, the people's revolution as a way of changing government. The response is often very weak in this regard. So when you see people are brutalizing rights, like they are brutalizing people's rights because they've not done coup, you don't find democracy promoting countries calling them to order or even sanctioning them immediately at that point. When they change the constitution, it doesn't happen. But when there is a coup d'etat, everybody comes around and they are quickly able to mobilize and start putting on sanctions that further affects the people. These are the cause that you can think of. It's the lack of democracy, or in this instance, that often leads to this kind of challenges. And I think democracy promotion will have to change going on forward, not just to what can the likes of Switzerland do in terms of promoting rights. We want to talk about more civics, as important components. I was telling colleagues earlier that any form of democracy promotion will have to think of who the actors will be, who they must actually be local, the duration of the support itself. It cannot be anything short. It has to be in for a long haul as well. The kind of programming is also extremely important. Like, what do you think of? Like, information integrity is one very important one, not just support for elections. Inclusion is a very important one that we really have to talk about. Technology is become like the new normal, for instance, and the reach itself and collaboration as very, very key, important purpose. So for this retreat, these two retreats, for instance, Ambassador Simon was making reference to bringing Botswana on the table, bringing the US, bringing Costa Rica, all these actors, a unified front will also work a long way in terms of democracy support, and countries like Switzerland will have to see it as part of their foreign policy, not just as a giveaway to some people in some parts of the world. It's a foreign policy agenda, and it's one where we have to see that the politics of geopolitics itself is important. So while Richard was answering the last question, he was talking about the failure of democracy to deliver as one of the challenges that has led to the erosion of democracy. But geopolitics has also played a very important role here now. How powerful can we say is the United States at this point in time? How powerful are the G5? What is the increasing role of Russia, China with Ukraine? And what is happening in the world between Israel and Palestine itself, which is further balkanizing people's support, and even this whole idea of Western democracy itself. It is impugning the integrity of it as the way out.
I think this is segueing to you now, Simon. What would this mean for a Swiss perspective, long term, of how Switzerland, as Idayat mentioned, would create an alliance of democratic, or be part of an alliance of democratic countries?
Maybe I go back a little bit to what Richard and Idayat have said. I think Richard is very right when he says that we have become quite defensive when it comes to democracy, when we talk about our own democracy. And I think we believe this narrative that is out there and that is pushed, obviously, by certain actors, that democracies don't function, that democratic values, by the way, also human rights and all these things, they are not really universal. This was an invention by the West, and so we should not talk about it. I don't believe that, and I'm not so sure about the not delivering argument, because when you look at the data, long-term data, okay, you can say in the long term we are all dead, but when you look at the long-term data, democracies, they are more peaceful than autocratic regimes. There are almost no cases where you have democratic countries fighting in a war against each other. I mean, this is the great theory of democratic peace, and the data underlines that this is not untrue. Democratic government delivers also economically in the longer term. You take one specific example, China, and then you say, because China is China, this is the model, and it's not true. It's one specific model, and it has a lot of factors that are also quite negative. Even you look at it purely from a developmental and delivery point of view. So I would be a bit more cautious with regard to this negative and downtrodden narrative that is out there. And I think that's the starting point for us too. First of all, I think what we will try to do more forcefully is to speak differently about democracy, to have a more optimistic tone, a more positive tone. Doesn't mean that we believe everything is well, even in Swiss democracy. Yes, we have challenges like any other democracy too. But we should be more positive And this kind of narrative should be shared or sharely developed with others, and not just with our neighbors and Western democracies, but with other democracies too. I mention again the example of Botswana, but there are many others too.
Maybe.
Because I really think that there is a common narrative that can be developed, and to be more positive about talking about who we are, what democracies are, and this gives us also a different credibility when we talk to these hybrid regimes Richard alluded to. But I think we have to do our homework too. I mean, we have to do the homework here in Switzerland before we start to talk to others. But when we talk to others, it's always in a partnership. It's not we tell Nigeria how you have to organize your democracy. This is not going to work, obviously. This is not what we want to do. This was maybe something that was done in the 1990s. This is over. The approaches we have today are completely different.
Thank you very much. Before we open the panel, before we open the room for questions from the audience, we've heard it now several times, but I'm not sure everybody knows what you're talking about when you mentioned the Botswana example.
Yeah.
So maybe just very briefly can, in a few sentences, say what the Botswana example is. So
when you look at the democracy rating, Botswana is the number one, the most democratic countries in Africa. Mauritius is still more democratic, but okay, they're island. So Botswana is the most democratic country in Africa. And that's why we invited someone, a fantastic person from Botswana to our Giesbach retreat in 2022. And it was very fascinating to talk to this person because she said, yes, first of all, and that's also interesting, we in the West, we always say democracy, human rights, it's not really universal, you know. And then when we talk to Idayat, when we talk to someone from Botswana, they tell us, what are you talking about? Of course it's universal. Of course we want to be free. Of course we want to have a choice. What do you think? I mean, you guys in the West, I mean, it's absurd in a way. Okay, so we had this discussion with Botswana, and they told us, look, we have developed our own democracy. We have local participation in our towns, in our villages. We have regional democracy. People come together. Yes, to a certain degree, women were excluded for a very long time also in this system, but it is a kind of bottom-up democracy that is very old and existed for a long time. And then the president of the Swiss Confederation, Mr. Berse, he decided to go to Botswana for a state visit, and then to invite the president of Botswana to Switzerland and to show him the Landsgemeinde. And they were there together. And I found this so fascinating to have the honor to be on a panel at the University of Fribourg together with the president of Botswana and have a discussion with him about what is democracy. And there we learned a lot of things also with regard to the e-government question. Botswana has done quite a good job. I mean, they are not far behind us, maybe they're even in front of us. And they have other ideas about participation, and we can learn from a country like Botswana. So while a lot of people said in Switzerland, why Botswana? Why does the president go to Botswana? He should go to I don't know, to Germany or to Austria. I found this a super good choice, because these are the kind of countries we want to work together with. Again, not telling them what to do, but learning from each other and have a partnership. And this is then a kind of alliance, again, not against someone, first of all, but strengthening our own resilience as democracies.
So also Botswana being able to give democracy support to Switzerland. So
yeah,
it's a two-way,
why not?
it's
Exactly.
a two-way street.
Absolutely, It should be a two-way street. Yes.
Thank you. At this point, I really would like to open the discussion. If you have questions and they are directed at one of the specific panelists, please mention the name. If you would like to ask the question in German, I will translate it as well. So, yes, please, feel free.
I have a question for whoever wants to answer it. I wonder,
these developments you talked about as well, about the decrease in trust also in democracy and this whole developments, they didn't start 2 or 3 years ago, but maybe more than a decade ago. And my question would be, what do you think, what role will this last few years of crisis governance play in this whole development? As also in democratic countries as Switzerland, we had to experience some years where the usual democratic system didn't work. And that has 2 different ways of playing out, in my opinion. On one way, the people were maybe frustrated because they didn't have the power to be part of the government as they usually have. The parliament didn't play the same role. But on the other side, they also learned that ignoring democratic systems brings really fast solutions. So it's like a 2-way street. On one way, it was shocking not to have the usual democracy, but on the other way, there's so maybe a certain efficiency in the way of government. So how do you think this will impact the view of democracy in the future?
I think the question would be best directed at Richard right now, maybe? Richard, would you like to answer?
There's no easy answer to the reason why democracies have struggled in recent years. And in fact, caution against trying to come up with a single answer on this. It's an enormous debate amongst academics. Some people say it's to do with economic factors. Others would say it's to do with identity factors. Others would say it's more the strategies of elites and not the change and not any growing frustration among citizens. The balance between those factors, I think, differs between countries. I tend to agree with Simon that this idea that democracies have fundamentally failed into delivering basic services can be a little bit overdone. And that doesn't mean that there aren't very serious problems there, but I think it does mean that there's not any easy policy lever to pull to address all these factors. I don't think there's any easy recipe to kind of save or rescue democracy. Democracy is just in this period of severe contestation and battle now, and I think that will be part of the dynamic going forward. That's a huge, the debate about the general state of democracy is a huge debate. I think it goes well beyond this panel on international democracy support. But I do think there's a link there, because in a way, all these democracy programs that we're talking about in this panel tend to have followed a particular kind of template and model for many, many years. And that is a little bit divorced about the factors that the questioner was raising, about the reasons why democracy is kind of moving forward, but then struggling to retain traction and support with citizens. So in a way that speaks to the need that I was suggesting for democracy support to kind of move with the times and address some of these more underlying issues to do with democracy, rather than just keep replicating the same kind of support programs to civil society activists.
Thank you. Who would like to add something? Everyone.
Yes. I think, I agree with Richard, but I'll just simply say that it's a combination of both internal and external factors that are actually responsible for some of these challenges. The internal factors, we have actually mentioned it, the failure of democracy, to the inadequacy people at times see in democracy, but we must also recognize that this is being weaponized by external actors to actually demarket democracy itself. There is so much demarketing, and that's what Ambassador Simon was talking about in terms of the kind of narratives that goes around showcasing more of the inadequacy, not the positives of democracy, which has made our work clear. In terms of how we remarket, we have to then aggregate all the positive stories democracy is brought and put it out in the public domain in local languages to different audiences as important. And then I also think that after the US elections, the Trump elections also, it really went a long way in terms of dampening democracy protection or promotion in the work that we do as practitioners. If after Trump of course emerged, everything that happened, it became a basis for people to start questioning and claiming that what is the essence of that democracy itself. That big democracy, the United States, that we all look up to as the beacon of democracy, is actually failed and is failing. The kind of things that were done in the prelude to the elections, after the elections, and of course the incursion into the Congress, again, was a very big indicator. And as well as the fact that during that period, put together, what geopolitics became kind of diluted, altered, as well as the rise of the identity issue, the rise of nationalism and nationalist parties across the world. This has had a much more huge impact when you think of it. So what is happening in Switzerland, of course, has got impact in Niger, really. It has impact because people do read the news. People do hear what is happening. There are cultures. It also means that some of the support that comes, for instance, to countries in Africa is reduced because the focus, the attention, the agenda itself shifts at that point in time, and it goes a long way in terms of affecting democratic ideals, really.
Maybe 3 quick points from my side. I disagree that democracies are less efficient, again, in the long term than autocratic regimes. Yes, it's true, autocratic regimes can decide much quicker. But quick decisions mean that they are often not legitimate.
Yes.
The population had no say in them. They're not sustainable. And democracies have the big advantage that they can self-correct. And we have seen this again and again, also, by the way, in the United States. They can self-correct. Autocracies cannot self-correct because if the dictator decides, if he changes his mind, he undermines himself and his legitimacy. So I would caution about this idea that democracies are less efficient. And COVID, for me, was a great example because everybody said, look, these autocracies, they're so fast, they're so good, they have perfect solution, and we democracies, we're lagging behind and so on. Yeah, but you have to wait until the end of the story, and then it looks very differently. So that's just as a small reminder on that. Then the other thing I think we have to make very clear that democracy is some quite messy stuff. I mean, this is people debating, having different opinions, being very vocal about things, about the candidates they support, about the programs. This is a messy thing. This is not just harmonious, and it has to be like this. And sometimes we think democracy, that's harmony. It's not at all. And again, as I know the US a bit, I mean, we believe today that's the most horrific things that ever happened to the United States. Look back at the 1860s, you might say this was not a real democracy back then, but you had how many? 400,000 people killed in a civil war. Look at the 1960s, 1970s, you had presidential candidates, presidents shot, you had tremendous turmoil. Democracy was really in extremely bad shape, and it was possible to correct that. However, I think, yes, I agree, there is one difference, maybe a qualitative difference, and that's really the whole social media environment. You didn't have that. When I grew up, I mean, I read the newspaper in the morning, that's what they had, and then the next newspaper came 24 hours later, and maybe you looked still the news in the evening. This is different qualitatively, and I think this is one of the big challenges I think we face. And when I talk to my son about social media, and I give him the stories, and it's dangerous, it's bad, and what does it mean for democracy, he laughs at me and says, "Oh, we will manage, no problem." It's just you guys don't understand it. We will see, but I think that's the really interesting qualitative difference. But maybe we are in this phase of reconfigurating and of finding a new way how democracy works in this new environment. And I still believe and I hope that we can be optimistic about it, but there are challenges, obviously.
Thank you. Yes, another question here. We are a bit tight on time, so try to keep it...
Frankly spoken, it's not a question, it's more a bit the background comment. I'd like to go a step further and state that for me, after reporting about democracy and analyzing democracy for several years for SwissInfo.ch, I understand democracy as one of the fundamental principles is our paradox. What's the English word? Paradoxons and contradictions. This is absolutely basic for democracies. And for instance, Switzerland has no political education for school kids about information of the kids with basic information, what democracy is, this kind of mindset we heard about. And I also think that there is not only a mistrust from down to the bottom, but there is also a mistrust in democracy from top down when we look at the very painful story of inclusivity in Switzerland. It's not only about the women, it's also about the youth, it's about foreigners, it's about disabled people. When we look at France, the struggle for initiatives, this really very complex instrument, political rights for the divided, I don't know the correct term in German, the divided people's initiative and the struggle in Germany that there is no vote on federal level. So I think these are momentums, important momentums in the problems to fight, authoritarian regimes and autocracy. So I think I agree with Simon that there is a lot of homework to do, even in Switzerland, that is, celebrated in the world as a very, very high-ranked example.
I would like to take up one input from there. Mindset was something that was mentioned before as well in one of your quotes. A democratic mindset. How do you nurture that? Does it just happen through top down, or is bottom up, or how do you nurture a mindset of when we say, okay, let's compare it to, okay, let's go to a party and let's make it a party. That's a mindset, right? Even if the music's not necessarily my taste, for example, I can still decide to honor it. How do we do this? Nobody wants to answer.
No, I can go ahead. Maybe not as a diplomat, but as a political scientist, I take a different hat because this is not really a diplomat's question. It has been mentioned by several of you. I mean, education is certainly important. It's key. I mean, as I say, yes, you might have an urge to be free, an urge to participate. But this is also something you have to learn, you have to relearn all the time. So I think education is really key. The other thing, of course, and that's also a challenge for democracy, is democracy is based on debate. It's talking to other people. It starts maybe at the kitchen table in your family or in your village and so on. But this is key. I mean, democracy is about interacting with others, talking to each other. That's absolutely key. And there, of course, we have a challenge, because the intermediary institutions that have been key to foment this kind of debate, they are no longer there, or they have no longer the same impact. I mean, associations, sports clubs, political parties, all these kind of institutions, they're crumbling. And again, maybe there are new institutions developing, but I'm not sure that sitting in front of a screen or in front of an iPhone will create this kind of debate culture that we had and we have. And I think this is a challenge for all of us, for the politicians, but also for us as a society. How can we create also these institutions where we debate, where we exchange, and where we not just go into our bubbles on social media, where we just read what reinforces what we already know or believe to know. I think these are huge challenges we face.
Thank you. Richard, yes?
Well, my very quick wrap-up would be that these are huge questions affecting democracy. International democracy support from outside can't help to resolve all these issues. At best, it can play a very modest secondary role simply in facilitating open political debate. The first thing Western governments need to do is stop acting to the detriment of democracy. In most countries around the world, geopolitical interests, as Idayat was saying, actually are unwittingly perhaps empowering authoritarian dynamics at the moment. So that's the first hurdle that Western governments need to get over. And then secondly, I think they can just play this secondary role in just keeping some of this open debate alive. Democracy is not going to solve all these issues. All these afflictions facing democracies are not going to evaporate. But the advantage that democracy should have is people participating, engaging in debate about the way that their societies address these challenges. And that's not about very technical programs about election observation or administrative reform. It's just about trying to get people engaged in many, many different ways in debating the big decisions affecting their own societies. And whatever model you call that in terms of democratic reform, it seems to me that's where the real challenge lies, and where countries like Switzerland can play a modest but very helpful role in the future.
Thank you. We also have people watching the live stream, and I think there has been a question coming in.
Yes. So someone is asking also more of a specific question, and the question is: the EU is turning into a fortress that turns away migrants with illegal pushbacks or inhuman conditions in detention camps, for example. How democratic is this trend?
Who is the question going
Richard.
to? Please.
Richard. Richard can speak to it.
Okay. We cannot hear you, Richard.
I said the audio is not great. I'm not getting all of these questions. If I understand correctly, it was about migration, right?
Yes, maybe Stephanie can repeat the question slowly.
Yeah, so the question, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question was that the EU is turning more and more into a fortress with illegal pushbacks and more worse conditions in detention camps. So the question is, how democratic is this trend?
Yeah, I think that this is just one issue amongst many that is kind of undermining the credibility and the clarity of the democracy commitment. I mean, migration is one, but there are lots of others. There are all the kinds of political and strategic issues my colleagues on the panel were talking about. In fairness, what I would have to say, if we had an EU diplomat here, they would insist that in all these border control and migration programs, there are elements relating to human rights, and it doesn't completely undermine the commitment to democratic reform. But in practice, it does look as if it's tilting the scales in quite an unhelpful direction. Again, as a wrap-up conclusion, I would come back to the point I think it was Idayat made, that democracy promotion up until now has functioned quite well as a kind of separate area, almost part of the development assistance agenda. It hasn't really been at the heart of the big geopolitics of international relations. And I think if democracy support is to survive in the future, then the big question is whether it can become part of that kind of mainstream approach to geopolitics, because if not, then I think the danger is that it will just get sidelined by all these very other big challenges facing European nations.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yes?
A very short question or point. It was very interesting, but one aspect was not there. The intelligence of society. I think that is one of the most important things if you want to establish democracy. There was a talk about people coming, discussing, and so on. But only intelligent people can discuss this. And it's very important,
So
I think.
intelligent societies, I think we've crossed this topic with education, as educating people to know what the tools are that they can be working with and how to foster debate. I think, unless someone wants to answer that, we can...
I think it's really the quality of information that is the challenge, really. Currently, the quality of information is extremely poor. It's diluted, very polluted, and it's been weaponized, and such that even when we want to have those debates, the ability to sort fact from fiction become extremely difficult, because people are thrown either into their silos on whatever basis that we can think of, really.
You had mentioned in your paper, you called for, so on social media, what we are seeing now is the principle of, flooding the zone with shit. So everyone gets very confused, and that plays, of course, into certain hands. And you had, in your paper, asked for common rules for these platforms, global standards for social media. Now, my question is, how to do that? Is there a body that could do this? How do we agree on different ideas of morality, maybe, or what should be allowed and what not, on a global scale?
No, I think the first thing is really about a common rule, but rooted in local nuances at every point in time. There are some things that are basics, just like we talked about democracy. Calling for violence online in Switzerland will be the same as it will in Kenya, really, as in inciting violence. There is no difference in it. But currently, the challenge is that the standards in developed countries are different from the standards in developing countries. So what is possible in Germany? Germany is like the epitome of how do I call it, responses, platform responses in terms of moderation, standards. It's not the same. Then when you even come to Africa, or even Africa and Asia, for instance, what is applicable in Asia, Latin America, what Brazil gets, or what India, the standards in India are actually better than the standards in Nigeria and South Africa. Then you take Nigeria is actually an outlier, benefiting more than Cape Verde or Niger Republic, really, in terms of content moderation. So the attention that is actually placed, the moderation principles and standards are almost non-existent in developing countries. The response rate is almost nil. Like I know during the last Nigerian elections, we flagged like 33 claims, and only one was removed. The other two was removed like 2 weeks after the elections. And don't forget, CDD was a partner to this particular platform. It's not like an individual that is just reporting. So the response is extremely low, and it's non-existent. And when we think about the challenge of saying that, if we have global standards, it will be again the ethics of it. The question we often hear is, but it will be somebody in Indonesia that will be removing contents in Kenya. That shouldn't be. It should be Kenya for Kenya, and it should be in as many languages as possible. And there are some standards that are universal, and we have to keep to those universal standards while we then look at what is rooted in the local nuances, like use of local languages, what this might mean in this context, but it's actually a must do. And this time around, we are talking about self-regulation as very, very important, because it's like the social media itself, the tech platforms, is become the ungoverned spaces. Most times when we talk about ungoverned spaces, we think in terms of those spaces where conflict rises, especially you are thinking of Africa, you are seeing terrorists, or you are seeing rebels fighting. But social media currently is an ungoverned space in most parts of the world. Even where it's governed, the governance is just like maybe 10% or 15%. So we have to bring them towards an acceptable standard. And I would say one good thing we are doing at the level of Africa currently is that there is a move by the electoral bodies to create a standard as it relates to elections and social media. And this has been going, and it's reached a very high level with experts involved in helping to craft something that is acceptable to both governments and to platforms as well, like a responsibility to protect, which is extremely important. So we have to be able to do it either at the level of the UN, either at the level of countries like Switzerland, who has also got the opportunity as neutral parties, which they always say they are, to moderate a common standard like that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we will have to wrap it up here. We have already spent more time than we actually planned, but it has been very interesting. Thank you so much for coming tonight and for debating and listening and asking questions. Thank you very, very much to my panelists, Simon Geisbühler, Idayat Hassan, and Richard Youngs, for the very engaged conversation. It has been a pleasure. Don't forget to pick up your book on the way out, and we can continue the conversation at the aperitif outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you also very much from our side for the discussion, and also for the audience for contributing and staying for such a long time. Now we invite you for some drinks and food at the Democracy Bar. It's not a democracy party, but we can start it from there, and there's some room for exchange and further discussion. Thank you very much.
Das ist von der
It was a pleasure.
Marguerite, das ist Idayat und Stefanie. Okay.